الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله تعالى من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له. ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له. ونشهد أن سيدنا ونبينا محمدا عبده ورسوله. أما بعد، قال الله تبارك وتعالى في القرآن العظيم بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وإذ قال موسى لقومه إن الله يأمركم أن تذبحوا بقرة قالوا أتتخذنا هزوا قال أعوذ بالله أن أكون من الجاهلين. ثم أما بعد. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions consistently throughout the Quran the stories of the nations that have passed, stories of the people of the past. And these stories, these great historical events, have not been mentioned just for purely informational purposes or entertainment, but rather they are mentioned to us, and sometimes the same story from different angles, so that we may take heed from it, so that we may take lessons and benefit from these stories that have been mentioned. And of the nations that have passed, one group of people, their story has been told multiple times. Different aspects of the story have been told multiple times. And this is none other than the Bani Israel, the children of Israel. This is a group of people whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has honored, He has spoken highly of. يا بني إسرائيل اذكروا نعمتي التي أنعمت عليكم وأني فضلتكم على العالمين. The children of Israel, remember my blessings that I have bestowed upon you, and how I have raised you above the ala al-alamin, amongst the rest of mankind at that particular time. But in addition to that, in addition to the praise, He has also, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has also reprimanded them, and He has consistently also criticized them and called them out for their transgression, for their disobedience towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And inshallah, in today's khutbah, I want to discuss this one story in particular that really highlights this and lessons that we can derive from this. This story is known as the story of the cow, the story of the Baqarah, in which Surah Baqarah is named after. And before we get to the ayat, a bit of context is needed. In the time of Bani Israel, in the time of Musa alayhi salam, there was a very rich and wealthy man. However, this man, he didn't have anyone to pass his wealth on to. He didn't have any children. And his intention was that when he passes away, all my inheritance, everything that I earn, I hand over to my nephew. He had a nephew. And so what happens is that this nephew, because he was greedy and because he was impatient, perhaps he didn't know that he was going to attain this inheritance. So what he does is that he kills his uncle. He kills him. And after killing him, he takes his body and he puts it before somebody else's doorstep. He puts it before somebody else's house. And he does this at night, and he runs off. He comes the next day to this house where his uncle has been left, and he calls for murder. He calls for revenge. That, somebody's murdered my uncle. Who could have done this? Justice needs to be done immediately. And he starts to blame. And then people start to gather around him, and they too begin fighting, start blaming, and some people are with him, so whoever he's blaming, they're blaming them. And it gets to the point where they almost begin fighting physically, until the elders of the community, they called for them to stop. So they said, why are we fighting amongst each other when we have the Rasul of Allah in our presence? Meaning when we have Musa alayhi salam with us. So they all went to Musa alayhi salam to basically find out what to do. How do we satisfy this task? How do we find out who the killer was? Because there's a lot of blame going around. We need a clear answer. So Musa alayhi salam, can you please go and ask Allah? So this is where the story starts in Surah Baqarah. So Musa alayhi salam goes to Allah, asks, what shall I do? Allah Ta'ala tells him what to do, so he comes back to his people. And so it starts. وَإِذْ قَالَ مُوسَى لِقَوْمِهِ إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرُكُمْ أَن تَذْبَحُوا بَقَرَةً. And remember when Musa said to his people, indeed Allah has commanded you to slaughter a cow. أَن تَذْبَحُوا بَقَرَةً. Slaughter a cow. Now you would expect after you as a group of people, you go to your message, you go to your prophet, and you ask him for guidance, and he tells you what to do. You expect that once he tells you that you submit to this and you follow this immediately. But the Bani Israel were a different breed, you could say. So instead of submitting to the command of their prophet, which they asked for, they say, قَالُوا أَتَتَّخِذُنَا هُزُوًا. That, Musa, are you joking with us? Is this some type of game that you're playing with us? You're telling us to slaughter a cow? What type of joke is this? And I just want us to imagine the scene. I want us to imagine if this was somebody doing, if someone was doing this to the Prophet of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Somebody questions him. And in fact, something like this did happen. After one of the battles, Battle of Hunayn, the Prophet is distributing the spoils of war, the war booty, as they say, and a man stands up from the crowd and he says, "I'dil ya Rasulullah, be just, O Messenger of Allah." He is telling the Prophet of Allah to be just. Can you imagine this? It's insane. And the Prophet reprimanded him. He said, "Waylaka, woe to you." And at this time, Umar radiallahu anhu became furious, and he said to the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam that, Prophet, give me the command and I will take his head off. But the Prophet said, no, be patient, Umar. And the Prophet in fact warned us that there will be people around him, or people coming from his bloodline, that they will pray in such an expressive manner. They will recite Quran, but it will not go beyond their throat. Essentially, and what this will do is that when you look at them praying, when you look at them fasting, you will think that you are inadequate. But the reality is, and the ulama, when they look back, they say that the group of people that the Prophet was referring to was the first group of people that broke away from the mainstream of Islam. So these people were known as the Khawarij. That is a separate point. But going back to the story of Musa alayhi salam. So he's told them, he's commanded them to slaughter a cow. They say to him, are you joking with us? Then Musa alayhi salam, he seeks refuge in Allah. He says, A'udhu billahi an akuna min al-jahilin. That, oh Allah, I seek refuge in this type of ignorance. So, he's told them once again, slaughter a cow. Should be enough. But now they begin to question him further. قَالُوا دَعُ لَنَا رَبَّكَ يُبَيِّنْ لَنَا مَا لَوْنُهَا. Oh Musa, مَا هِيَ رَبَّكَ مَا هِيَ. That, what type of cow should it be? What type of cow should it be? Musa alayhi salam goes back to Allah and he asks, what type of cow? Comes back with a command that لَا ثَارِدٌ وَلَا بِكْ, that it should not be too young and it should not be too old. It should be somewhere in the middle. فَفْعَلُوا مَا تُؤْمَرُونَ. Now do as you've been commanded. So that's two things. So he commands them, they question him, then they question him further, then he tells them, a cow, the age of the cow should be somewhere in between, not too old, not too young? Do you think that should be enough? No. Another question. قالوا ادع لنا ربك يبين لنا ما لونها. Now they're asking, what type of color should the cow be? What type of color should the cow be? So Musa alayhi salam goes back to Allah and he asks, comes back. The cow should not be, the cow should be a bright, deep type of yellow, and something that is pleasing to look at. That should be enough. So he's told them age, and he's told them the color. That should be enough, right? No. One more time. قالوا ادع لنا ربك يبين لنا ما هي إن البقرة تشابه علينا. That Musa, call upon your Lord so that he may make clear to us which type of cow. For verily all types of cows, they look the same to us. Now what they mean by this is, and the answer makes a bit more sense. So Musa alayhi salam, he comes back. قال إنه يقول إنها بقرة لا ذلول تثير الأرض ولا تسقي الحرث مسلمة لا شيء فيها. That Allah Ta'ala says to slaughter a cow that has not been used to till the soil nor water the fields, meaning it hasn't been overworked too much, and that it's of adequate, you could say, physique. So now finally, after this excessive questioning, so just to go through again. So first they ask, what type of age should the cow be? Second, the color, and now its physique essentially. So now finally, after this, they say that قالوا الآن جئت بالحق, that you have brought the truth to us. فذبحوها وما كادوا يفعلون. Now that you come with the truth to us. However, even after accepting these conditions, it is said that they were still hesitant in their slaughtering of the cow. And it is also further mentioned in the hadith that if these people, they did not obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's command without raising so many doubts and without raising so many unnecessary questions, they wouldn't have been given such strict conditions. And so this is also a lesson for us that at times it is not good to get into the why, into the excessive question. Understanding the wisdom behind something it's okay to do, but constantly asking why, if it serves no benefit, if it does not bring any type of benefit to us, it's useless. Now we move forward. وَإِذْ قَتَلْتُمْ نَفْسًا فَادَّارَأْتُمْ فِيهَا. So they slaughtered the cow. Now they've just been told that once you've slaughtered the cow, cut a piece of the cow and strike the dead body. But before I get to that, there's some important verses to get to. So وَإِذْ قَتَلْتُمْ نَفْسًا فَادَّارَأْتُمْ فِيهَا. So the story goes back to the start, that when a man was killed and you disputed who the killer was, وَاللَّهُ مُخْرِجٌ مَا كُنْتُمْ تَكْتُمُونَ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what you concealed. See, when they started disputing and arguing and they started blaming each other, they thought that they could get away with it. That the person who was the actual killer, he thought that he could get away with it by starting up an argument. However, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He knows what you conceal. وَأَسِرُّ قَوْلَكُمْ أَوْ اجْهَرُوا بِهِ إِنَّهُ عَلِيمٌ بِذَاتِ الصُّدُورِ. Whether you speak secretly, whether you speak loudly, verily Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what is concealed inside of your hearts. There's no point in trying to hide it from Allah. So now once again, like I said, they're told to cut a piece of the cow and to strike it onto the man. فَقُلْنَا ضْرِبُوهُ بِبَعْضِهَا. And what happens is that when they hit the man, he stands up back to life, as if he had never been dead. And they ask him, the people around, they ask him, who was the one who killed you? And he points to his nephew and he says, he is the one who killed me. And after saying this, he goes back to being dead. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, كَذَلِكَ يُحْيِي اللَّهُ الْمَوْتَى وَيُرِيكُمْ آيَاتِهِ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَعْقِلُونَ. That this is how easily Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings the dead to life. And that this is a sign for those who witness this, and also the ones who are now reading it, to understand. So it's a sign for those people that were there, a miracle that they've just witnessed, to have a more pure conviction and to have a more stronger conviction of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and a sign for us reading this centuries after this particular event happened, that like He brought the dead back to life in this particular scenario, we too will one day be presented before Allah after having been dead. We too will be brought back to life, and we will be questioned for what we've done. So, moving on from this. After this whole incident is mentioned, and the story ends there. After this whole incident is mentioned, Allah Ta'ala, He analogizes the hearts of people, or in this scenario, the hearts of the Bani Israel, with rocks. So He says, ثُمَّ قَصَدْ قُلُوبُكُمْ مِنْ بَعْدِ ذَلِكَ فَهِيَ كَالْحِجَارَةِ أَوْ أَشَدُّ قَسْوَةً. That even after they, the Bani Israel, witnessed this miracle before them, the dead coming back to life, their hearts became hardened like a rock, أو أشد قسوة, or even harder than a rock. So once again, the comparison is that their hearts is like the hardness of a rock. Now obviously not literally, but in a metaphorical, in a spiritual sense, that once your heart becomes hardened, it closes off from the rahmah, from the mercy of Allah. And it's not that Allah has done this, it is you have done this yourself. Because you have become willfully ignorant. You have become heedless of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded you to do. You've become ignorant of his prohibitions, meaning you engage in the prohibitions, and you do not follow what He has commanded. Now, another verse that speaks about, in particularly the Bani Israel, how their hearts became hardened like a rock, and they themselves said this, وَقَالُوا قُلُوبُنَا غُلْفٌ, that our hearts have become unreceptive, our hearts have become unresponsive. And multiple commentators in the Quran, they say that this means قُلُوبُنَا غُلْفٌ means that they put a stamp on their heart, a seal on their heart. And they said this in the context that when the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam went to them with the message, they were arrogant, and they said that قُلُوبُنَا غُلْفٌ, that we don't need what you're coming to us with. We already have the knowledge, we already have the truth. We don't need what you're telling us. And so they themselves are rejecting it, and they're choosing to be ignorant, but really they're arrogantly ignorant. And so in a way we can liken this to the state of some people's hearts as well, in that we have chosen to go against the command of Allah, that we have ignored His commands and engaged in His prohibitions. And when this happens, our heart becomes sealed, and it becomes unresponsive to any type of good that happens. Or that we become unresponsive, we detract ourselves away from any type of good. And you could say that desires have overtaken this person's heart. Desires aren't necessarily to do with lusts and of that nature, but desire to be arrogant, to be powerful, to be superior in an unlawful way. This is also a type of desire that is destructive to one's spiritual being. And so what you could say is that when the person's desires, when his lowly self has taken hold of him, then it is as if the shaitan resides inside this person's heart. And what's really happening is that shaitan is the one pulling the strings in this person's heart, making him unresponsive to whatever good comes his way. Now, some of the symptoms of a hard heart. How do we recognize if we have a hard heart? First of all, Allah Ta'ala, He tells us that having a hard heart is actually a form of punishment. And He says this in regards to the Bani Israel, right after they broke their covenant with Allah. He said that for breaking the covenant, He has condemned them and He has hardened their hearts. Now, what are some of the cures for a hard heart? What can we do to soften our hearts? Number one is that reflection upon the Quran. Allah Ta'ala says, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ أَمْ عَلَى قُلُوبٍ أَقْفَالُهَا. Do they not reflect? Do they not ponder upon the Quran? Or have their hearts become, or is it because their hearts have become locked? Their hearts have become chained. And there is a statement of the pious of the past that reflection upon one ayah of the Quran is greater than reading the entire Quran but not really understanding what's going on at all. And like the people that I mentioned at the start, that they would be praying in such a exotic and in such an expressive way, and they'd be reading Quran abundantly, but it wouldn't go beyond their throats. For many, unfortunately, this has become the case, that we read the Quran abundantly. We fail to understand what it actually means. Now, avenues to improve upon this. The obvious one is to learn Arabic, but not everyone can do that. So what is the next thing that we do? There's abundant translations in every single language. So as much as you can, recite the Quran and also try to follow along with the translation. And where you don't understand, you go to a person of knowledge to clear up any doubts. Another statement of the pious of the past, they said that the Quran was revealed to be implemented, but people made its recitation the aim, meaning they've ignored the understanding and they've just merely gone to reciting the Quran. And so he was asked, how do we implement the Quran? So he said that first thing to do is to hold on to the permissible acts to be permissible, and its prohibited acts to be prohibited. Meaning, what is halal, you acknowledge that it's halal. What is haram, you acknowledge that it's haram. You do not try to change and convolute the two. You leave them as they are. And then he says, abiding by the orders of the Quran and abandoning the prohibitions. And then finally, reflecting upon its wonders. Because the Quran is an ayah, it is a sign of the many signs of Allah. And it contains within itself many, many things for us to reflect upon. Constantly we are told, أَفَلَا تَذَكَّرُونَ أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ أَفَلَا تَدَبَّرُونَ. That do we not contemplate, do we not think, do we not reflect, do we not understand? And so this is in regards to the ayat of Allah. Now, some of the signs that one has a hard heart. Number one is that a person becomes selfish. A person becomes selfish. How so? He becomes ignorant, or he chooses not to engage with the state of his surroundings. He chooses to ignore oppression. He chooses to ignore injustice. You don't need to necessarily, fight against it with your own hands. But at the very least you can do is inform yourself of what's going on in the world, particularly in regards to Muslims. Our dear Muslim brothers and sisters are suffering all throughout the world. In China, in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Palestine, in Burma. So much injustice, so much oppression, but many of us, we've become so... Another factor to this is that you could say that we've become immune to it. When we see, X amount of people have been killed, 100, 200, it just becomes like another statistic to us. And so, one of the things that we should be doing is that we should be, at the very least, if we cannot speak up against it, if we cannot change it with our hands, at the very least, hate it in your heart. Feel the pain of what our ummah is going through. Acknowledge what the ummah is going through. And so a cure to this, on a bit of a small scale, is that one of the ways to become acquainted with what's going on is to help out those that are in need. Is to help out the people that are in need. So volunteering, visiting the elderly. One of the Sahaba, he came to the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he said that, how do I develop a soft heart? How do I get rid of the hardness of my heart? And he was told to spend time with the poor and needy people, and to basically give care towards an orphan, or to stroke the head of an orphan, because it humbles you. It makes you feel. It makes you, first of all, give comfort to them. It makes you thankful of the blessings that you have, and it makes you a source of goodness for others. And as we know, what is the return of good except good? هل جزاء إلا الإحسان إلا الإحسان. And so to finally conclude, the Bani Israel, the story of the Bani Israel, the story of the cow, it is an important reminder for us that, number one, engaging in unnecessary questioning, engaging in unnecessary acts, this is something that it hardens the heart. And there are different levels of, you could say, hearts, different types of rocks that I wanted to go through, but time has run out. And so the cure to this is to engage in the commandments of Allah and to stay away from the prohibitions. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك ونشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك.